Marie Battistone, and welcome back to Norfolk Notables. Like so many things that you've loved, we haven't been around for a while, but we're here today, and with me is Glenn Hill, who happens to have been a pilot at one time. Not a commercial pilot.
Private.
A private pilot. So he's going to talk to us about that. Oh, well, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for having me. I'm really happy to be here with you again today.
Now, you said that you always wanted to fly, or that from the time you were a child, you were interested in airplanes.
I did. My parents took me aboard an airliner once from Washington, D.C. to LaGuardia in New York. And we passed by the cockpit and I was mesmerized. I wanted to be that person. I knew in that moment I wanted to be that person with the hat on and the gold braids. It was something for me to aspire to. And I fell in love instantly with aviation.
So, but you didn't pursue an ordinary route like what the commercial pilots do?
I didn't. I just started my journey to aviation seeking a private pilot's license.
Now, you owned a plane.
Yes, I did. I actually bought the airplane that I learned to fly in. November 904681 was its tail number.
And where did you keep it? Over in Norwood?
I kept the airplane initially at Hanscom Field, and that's where I learned to fly. Later on,
up in near Belmont, or?
Hanscom's in Bedford, and it's a commercial airport. However, there are military aircraft that are there. Very popular. It's a great airport to learn to fly at because it's very busy. So that keeps pilots on their toes. And I used to keep the airplane there, and I leased it back to a flight school where other students would learn to fly in my airplane. And later on, I would come to bring the airplane down to Norwood, which was closer to home.
But now you told me that there was a little impediment to your being to being a pilot. It had something to do with mathematics?
You're right about that. I was a terrible math student. I flunked high school algebra twice. It was one of the largest embarrassments of my life. And so, of course, flying, as you might imagine, involves quite a bit of math. In fact, I'd make the argument that it's all math. I was so convinced that I could not do math that I figured, well, I'm not going to ever be able to fly. So it occurred to me that perhaps I should go try to get a pilot's license and maybe I'd get over my fear of math, which I later did.
But you were able to get it with the math skills that you had?
I made it work.
Now that thingamajig there that you had just showed me, that's a calculation of what?
This is called an E6b Flight Computer, or otherwise known to pilots as a whiz wheel. And you can carry it aboard in the aircraft, and it will allow you to enter certain parameters such as the speed of the winds aloft and the direction of the winds aloft, whereby you can derive from this E6b computer what angle you need to make to correct your heading to make sure that your aircraft does not get blown off course. You can also use the E6b to determine your fuel consumption, how much fuel remains, and how far that fuel can take you. It's a very handy device. It doesn't have any batteries. It can never fail. The worst that you could do is lose it out the window.
Now what's this part down here that just has numbers?
The small part that you see down at the bottom actually represents the compass rose, and you can use this to apply over your aviation chart to determine routes and angles and compass directions that you need to fly to reach your destination. It's a very handy device.
Now you mentioned winds. Now how do you know that? How do you know exactly what it is at any given time?
That's a great question. The way that we know the winds aloft is by the FAA sending up balloons, weather balloons, every day from certain locations. And those balloons transmit back to the surface both the temperature at altitude and the wind speed and wind direction at various altitudes. And then these days we use a computer to obtain that information. In the olden days when I learned to fly, you had to use a telephone to get that information.
So now these balloons, where does the information land?
The information lands at ground receivers. They used to launch a balloon every day from Chatham, Massachusetts. However, they stopped that because it was uneconomical. And now they launch them every day from the closest location that you and I would recognize would be Albany, New York.
And even though we're all the way over here, that's what you would go by?
Yes. The winds aloft within 200 miles don't often change much. Right. Over a course of maybe 500 miles, that could change a lot depending upon the position of weather systems.
Oh, that should have made sense. I'm exposing my ignorance. Now, so What was it like? I mean, so originally you were not flying in this plane that you bought.
No, my very
You were at the school.
first flight was in a different aircraft. However, the details of that flight are in my pilot logbook that I could read back the date and the tail number of the airplane that we flew that day.
And that's started in when you first bought that book. That's the first entry?
Yes, I can actually show it to you if you want to see it. I don't have my eyeglasses on, so it would be hard for me to read it, but there is a page that shows the very first flight.
It's a grid that goes all the way across.
It does, and you can probably read it better than I, but the date is shown, the tail number of the aircraft is shown.
Well, now what year? Oh, what, 50?
C-152 is the name of the aircraft.
It was March 2nd of 86?
There you go.
Huh, from
She
Bedford
has better vision than I do.
My glass one. Bedford to...
Local.
Oh, all right.
Just means in the
Remarks and
vicinity.
endorsements, single engine land, 7. Now that 7 is not consistent all the way down.
Right. That 7 that you see there is measured in tenths of an hour. And there's a small meter on board the aircraft that will count the time that the engine is running, and it's measured in tenths of an hour. And so that's what you enter in your pilot logbook.
So it's a little more than a tenth of an hour, obviously.
Almost an hour.
Yeah.
A little short of an hour.
Oh, all right. Oh, right. You know, we have a video that someone took while you were. Now, what year was this done?
It was done, I would guess, around 91 or 92. It's a while ago. This is on takeoff from the Martha's Vineyard Airport in Massachusetts, where you can see the runway out behind the aircraft. And now we enter a skidding turn, which is an indication of perhaps not the best pilot skills, but I am turning the airplane to come around to the proper heading to head towards Provincetown. And looking out the back of the plane, you might see a tiny little wire, which is a radio antenna. Out the side of the plane here, as we march north towards Provincetown, you can see the marshes off the east coast of Cape Cod. The aircraft
What town would this be that we're looking at?
Right now, we would be over Eastham,
Okay.
Eastham, Massachusetts. As we continue northbound, you can see the sun kind of glinting off the sea towards the end of the day, which even at a low altitude is a very beautiful sight.
Now, how high would you have been at this moment? Do you remember?
About 4,500 feet, which is a fairly low altitude for a flight. You generally want to have a little bit more altitude
There you
under
are.
your wings. And there I am with my headset on and my favorite grape chewing gum. And here you see the instrument panel that indicates your altitude, your radio equipment, your transponder, so that air traffic control can identify you, and a variety of other instruments that are essential to flight.
Now, is that coming into? Is that the? Are those the dunes over there?
Yep, you're seeing now the dunes. We're very close to Provincetown, and here we're on final for runway 25 at Provincetown, where very shortly you will probably hear a little squeak in the cockpit, which is coming up.
And what's that?
I'll tell you.
There it goes.
That squeak that you just heard is a stall warning, and the purpose of the stall warning is to make sure that if the wing should stall during flight, that the pilot is aware of that. And in landing, a stall warning is very important because as the stall warning is occurring, you want your wheels to be just then planted on the runway.
And that noise would mean that they're not coming down properly?
The noise happens when the flow of air over the wing becomes disturbed, where the wing can no longer produce lift. And if in flight you were to encounter such a situation, the nose of the airplane would pitch down and you begin to lose altitude. It's called a stall. It happens all the time. It's not supposed to happen, and a good pilot will not stall his airplane because the ground could rise up and smite you very quickly if you stall your airplane. So you don't want to stall the wing.
So then do you hear the wheels come down within the cockpit?
This is a fixed wing airplane, the Cessna 152. There are other aircraft which are known as retractable gear, where the wheels will actually come up after takeoff and then extend prior to landing.
Now, how many people could ride in this plane?
The C-152 is a pretty small airplane. Only 2 of us could fit in there. And owing to my ample girth these days, I would probably have to, if I were to flying today, I would have to offload some fuel to compensate for my weight.
But you look quite young in that picture.
I was quite young and dapper.
No. So now, did you have any mistakes or faux pas when you were? Did you have any problems when you were flying?
I did. I had a very serious problem one day en route from Hanscom Field to Poughkeepsie, New York. En route, approaching about 20 miles out of Poughkeepsie, the engine started to run rough. And that, of course, any good pilot is going to take immediate note of that and then run through what we call a checklist, which every aircraft has aboard, that cites the steps that you take to troubleshoot and solve your problem. So running through the checklist, I was unable to remedy the problem. The aircraft continued to run rough, and it became necessary to land. So at that point, luckily, the good pilot that I was in touch with air traffic control in New York and with their terminal radar approach control, and I simply asked them to please give me a vector, or a direction, if you will, a compass direction to the nearest airport, which they did, where I successfully landed and had the plane fixed.
So if you hadn't been near an airport or a landing strip, what would have happened?
Well, the best thing a pilot can do in cases like that is try to find an open space, perhaps a highway or a golf course or other open area. That's what's called a forced landing, which is a very serious event aboard an airplane. You do not want to be forced to land your aircraft, but it would be far preferable to land under control than not under control.
So when the first time, so you went to a flight school.
I went to the old Patriot Aviation at Hanscom Field, no longer in business.
And so the first time you went up, was it thrilling?
It was one of the biggest thrills of my life. It was the expression of something my father had forbidden me to do many years ago.
He thought it was too dangerous?
He thought it was too dangerous. He forbid me from taking flying lessons as a high school student. But I defied him one day, and I went to the local airport outside Washington, D.C., and took an introductory flight lesson.
Now, which one was that?
It's called Suburban Airport. It was a very small field right near Baltimore Washington International Airport. We took a flight, and I loved it.
Now, how did you get out there on your own? Did you have a driver's license?
I worked during high school, so I was licensed and I had a car, so it was pretty easy for me to get around.
So it was hard for him to clip your wings. You forgive the
Yes.
Forgive the pun.
He was not very happy when I came home that day because I confessed what I had done. However, he would later come to congratulate me for having earned a private pilot's license.
So when did you actually start, after high school? Was this in college when you actually started training?
I was way into my career when I started training in 1986.
Really?
It took a long time.
Now, what did you do? What job did you do? What was your career? What was your profession?
Early on, I was working in forensic photographic science, whereby I worked in a laboratory where we would seek to recover damaged evidence, damaged photographic evidence, perhaps of a crime scene or
Really?
Item of property, or various other forensic means of recovering damaged images. We did a lot of restoration of old images that had faded so completely that you could barely see what was on them. So our technology was pretty crude at the time, but we were able to restore images from items that were thought to be useless.
Now, what agency was this that you worked for doing this?
I worked for an organization called Northeast Color Research in Somerville. That was my first job out of college.
It was private.
It was a private industry. Later on, I would come to work in electronic telecommunications for military and defense purposes.
And now, what did you do then?
My job was to install telecommunication switches in various places throughout the world. I installed them in Argentina,
yes,
Europe.
That's the other thing. I don't know. I guess I don't have that picture. It was on your Facebook page. Of that, what is that building that's hanging by a thread on the edge of a mountain?
What you're referring to is the Tiger's Nest Monastery, and it's located in the Kingdom of Bhutan, high in the Himalayas. It is an old monastery that was built many, many years ago, and it is literally perched on the side of a 7,000-foot cliff. It is a sacred destination where many tourists will actually make the ascent every day from the valley below to Tiger's Nest Monastery above.
Is there steps carved into the? You know, if it's on your Facebook, so if you were to go on Glenn Hill's Facebook page, it's on there.
You'll be able to see it.
Yeah. But it looks like there's a string of flags.
There is a string of flags, Anne-Marie, and I'm glad you asked about it. Those are called prayer flags. And in the Buddhist theology, what people do is they write their wishes on a flag, and then they tie the flag to a string where the lore is that the wind will carry your wish along the air and along the rivers. It's a beautiful custom. It's a part of the Buddhist theology. And you'll find prayer flags throughout Bhutan. You'll find them on mountain passes. You'll find them at the Tiger's Nest Monastery.
And
you'll find them over rivers and fields. They're
and then
everywhere.
you'll find the flag that has just gotten separated from the string.
You could do that. There are many flags that fly atop mountain passes that are in tatters, but still they bear the evidence of a prayer having been written on them.
Huh. And you went up to this monastery.
We did. We hiked up to the Tiger's Nest.
Were there steps of any kind?
In some places, there might be a few crude steps, like a rock or a stone. Some of it, or most of it rather, is just dirt. It's earth, and you carry a walking stick.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a guide who is required to accompany you, which is the law in the Kingdom of Bhutan. You pay $250 a day for the privilege of being accompanied by a guide in Bhutan. It's a government-imposed fee. You must pay it. It includes all your meals and your guide services and your lodging each night.
So now, again, I'm unashamed when it comes to revealing my ignorance. Bhutan is but next to what?
Bhutan is a small kingdom that sits between India and China.
Oh.
Bhutan is a landlocked country. It is now just opening back up to tourism after COVID, which shut down much of the world's tourism. Bhutan generates electricity and sells it to India, which, as you might imagine, is a big consumer of electricity. The border between India and Bhutan is open, and there is free trade and free commerce, and people pass. However, the border with China is closed and has been closed for many years.
Now, what took you there, and when was this?
I have loved to travel ever since I can remember as a little kid, back to our story of boarding the airplane in Washington. I have always had wanderlust. I have always had appreciation for other cultures, other languages, other cuisine, history and historic sites. So from those delights came the wonder of travel.
Oh, but why Bhutan?
Bhutan actually was once featured on the Today Show, where Matt Lauer had his famous, which you may remember, "Where in the World is Matt Lauer?" And he showed up one day in Bhutan.
Huh.
I was transfixed. I said, we have to go to Bhutan. And from there and then came rise to the trip. It would be the last trip that I ever took before retirement.
Now, speaking of trips, weren't you in an airplane on 9/11?
We were. We were aboard.
What's that story?
On 9/11, that terrible day, we were en route to Los Angeles to catch a flight to Bangkok to start annual vacation. Needless to say, we didn't make it very far. We made it as far as Cleveland, where we landed successfully and safely. It was a very troubling day. We had no idea what was happening. It was a very, very troubling event.
So somebody, maybe it was you, somebody that was explaining to me that a flight like that was loaded with fuel for a long trip would have been one of the ones that they would have taken down to because the Pentagon's not that far from Boston.
That's exactly right. We were on a 767-300 extended range, which is one of the largest 767s that can be flown. The aircraft was completely loaded with fuel to take it all the way to Los Angeles, and then 45 minutes required fuel reserve in Los Angeles in case there was a necessity to circle to land or a closed runway or other event like that. So the plane was fully laden with fuel, not unlike any of the other aircraft that did not land successfully that day.
So were all the planes taken down that day, no matter where they were going?
All the transcontinental flights from the East Coast to the West Coast, unfortunately, did not make it that day.
And that's because they were assuming these were the planes that had all the fuel in them that would have been what they'd opt to use.
Our aircraft
to
had been suspected of being a hijack by the FAA. We actually have the radio transmission recordings at home from that day, whereby our aircraft was a suspected hijack until the pilot finally responded to the many calls that had been received from air traffic control trying desperately to reach the pilot. Finally, the pilot answered. We don't know why he delayed in answering, but he finally did. And it is only for that reason that our aircraft was not escorted by fighters.
But why did they assume there was a hijacking? They knew that you.
They assumed it was a hijack because many of the other transcontinental flights that day.
Somebody would have just gotten on there biding their time until.
Many of those flights had already been taken, and the FAA knew it. And so our flight, of course, was a suspected hijack as soon as these events started to unfold. The good news is that our flight never turned on its transponder, which communicates position and altitude to the ground, unlike all the other planes where the communications were disabled by the hijackers who took over those airplanes.
And how did they announce it? Did they go around and tell people individually, or
That's
did an
a really great
announcement come
question.
over?
I'll tell you what happened. We had a flight attendant who approached us, and she was a very slight, beautiful woman, and she kneeled down beside us and she said, "I have terrible news for you." She said, "A small airplane has impacted the World Trade Center." And we were confused because it was one of the most beautiful days we've ever seen. And as a pilot, I had great appreciation. It was crisp, it was clear, the sky was blue, there was no wind. It was one of those perfect days for flying that just doesn't get any better. So I was very confused when the flight attendant said that. I figured, how could this possibly happen? Then she came back and she told us that our airplane had lost contact with United Flight 93 that was very nearby. United 93 was only 20 miles away from us.
Why would is there normally contact between airplanes?
Normally
Just
there
so
is.
everybody knows where they are.
Yep.
And
A lot of times pilots will actually, if they are in visual range of another aircraft, they might call out to that airplane and just say hello.
Yes.
But there's usually not much chit chat that way, except on this day.
so did people did panic spread through the plane?
Oddly enough, there was no panic aboard the plane. In fact, the opposite happened. It was eerily quiet. There was no noise. The only noise we could hear was the noise of the engines. Before you know it, we were on the ground in Cleveland.
Now, how did you get home then? And what did they send you home, or?
Well, Delta Airlines put us up in a local hotel for about 3 days. And interestingly enough,
Really?
at the end of those 3 days, whereby before that, they were quite solicitous and helpful. And here's your meal voucher, and here's this, and here's that. We'll take good care of you. However, that came to an abrupt end at the end of 3 days. And we kind of knew at the moment, okay, we're done with Delta, and now we're on our own.
So why so many days? Why wouldn't they have just sent you off the next day?
Well, of course,
Everybody was just.
as you know,
with bated breath
airspace was closed in the United States. No airplanes would fly for at least 5 days following the incidents of 9/11. So we were on the ground, everybody else was on the ground. Apparently they felt like they had a duty to care for us for a few days, which they very graciously did. And we were very happy for that and glad to accept that help. However, at the end, like I mentioned, at the end of the 3rd day, it was over. It was clear to me that we needed to get home. We did not have our driver's licenses with us because we had no intent of driving in Thailand. Traveling internationally, all we needed was a passport, which of course we carried with us.
Yes.
But our driver's licenses sat home on the kitchen table.
So
we
how did
could
you
not
get
rent a
home
car.
then? Because you said it was 5 days that the planes were grounded. So that was
They were.
3 days. Where did you?
We hung out for a day. I called Amtrak 5 or 6 times in a row and finally snagged a couple of seats on a slow train to Boston. And after
That must have
doing
been
that,
an overnight, right? At least 1 or 2 overnights.
it was
right?
overnight all right. It took nearly 24 hours to get back to Boston.
Oh my goodness.
But we made it. We made it
Were
safely.
you in a sleeping car? You weren't able to get one? or-
There were no sleeping cars to be
Oh
had.
gosh.
Everybody wanted to get home that week, and there, of course, no one was flying, so you had a choice. You could rent a car if you had a license, or if not a
Right.
license, you had to take the train.
Oh my goodness.
But it
must-
was an okay ride. Everybody was in a good mood. People
Were
were
they?
friendly. They were kind. It was extraordinary
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
as you might imagine, that's not the way transportation is these days.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually harried. People are upset. They're tense. They're in
Yeah.
a hurry. But it wasn't like that at all.
Like maybe a sense of resignation that, life is short and you're not promised tomorrow and all that sort of thing.
I think you nailed it. Nothing is guaranteed in life. Our next second is not guaranteed. We can take steps to make sure that we underwrite the next few seconds, the next few hours, the next few days, but there are no guarantees. It was an instrument of fate that people we know died that day. 6 students from my beloved Northeastern University died that day in that accident.
right?
And I mourn their death to this very second. Miraculously, as would come
These were
out from this-
classmates or?
These were students that we knew. As luck would have it, that day we met 2 beautiful people from Los Angeles, Dr. Renee and Earl Cherniak, who became our very good friends and who to this day we maintain contact with. Earl passed away from a brain tumor, unfortunately, in 2012, but Renee and I have an ongoing email relationship. I call it a coast-to-coast email relationship. And we are very, very dear friends.
You know, I wonder if that 6 degrees of separation, I wonder if there's any truth to that.
I think you may be onto something there.
It was a film.
Yes.
And then, you know, I don't know where they came up with that, but, you know, this one knows the other one knows the other one. And I've often wondered about, you know, who I might, you know, who might be 6 degrees away from me that was, you know, that day in that, in these towers.
That's a very profound statement. In fact, that has applicability. I have a very close friend of mine who used to be a selectman here in Norfolk, and he was in the World Trade Center on 9/11. And I would later learn from him that he ignored the warnings of officials to leave, to remain in place in the building. And he said, I have to get out of here. And thank God he did, because he is alive today for having done that.
No, who is that?
That's Scott Bugme, a very good friend of ours,
yes, yes.
who was a former selectman here in town. He's
an
a wonderful person,
Yep.
and we are
Really?
very thankful that he had the presence of mind that day to ignore the instructions of public safety officials and leave the building. It is nothing short of a miracle.
They had told them to stay?
Yes, that day many people were told to remain in place, which is not uncommon in a public safety emergency. Sometimes people might be asked to shelter in place, remain in place,
yes.
don't make any sudden moves. But that advice was ignored by some people, honored by some people, but we're glad in this case that Scott chose to ignore it.
I didn't know that. Gee.
We're very thankful that he's with us today.
Right. Well, I think we're about out of time, although we could talk on. But I wanted to thank everybody for watching. This is Norfolk Notables. My guest was Glenn Hill, talking about his experiences as a pilot, as a private pilot. And thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.